morning. It's me again. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Tyler Sesnon. Who am I? I'll tell you who I am. I'm a licensed therapist, mental health therapist in Washington and Idaho. I have about 5 years of ministry experience. I worked with Impact Campus Ministries. George works for them. Eric Wright, who preached a couple weeks ago, works for Impact. Great experience. Loved it very much. And today I am kind of borrowing a lot of inspiration from my mentor who works at Impact, Marty Solomon. And I don't feel ashamed of it because the content I took it from him, he said he stole from somebody else, so it's great. And that's what discipleship is all about. Today, I kind of wanted to piggyback a little bit off of what Ryan spoke about a couple weeks ago, and it's great that Ryan's not here, so that he can't say that I got misinterpreted anything that he said. So, but I kind of want to discuss two stories and kind of elaborate off of that. So the first one's going to be story of David and Goliath, which, that's pretty, even in popular culture, that's pretty well known. And then the second one, maybe a little less known, is going to be the story about Jesus casting demons out of a man and sending them into pigs. But we'll get there. So there's a little setup, and bear with me, but it'll all make sense at the end. So starting with David and Goliath. So this story takes place in the Valley of Elah. And I wanted to provide a map because I think context is great. So understanding where that is, maybe it doesn't really mean anything to you, but at least you see Israel here. This is the Galilee. We'll be up here later. But this is the Valley of Elah, kind of right in this area. The Dead Sea, this is Jordan, like Tel Aviv here, where you fly into Israel if you go there. So just to get kind of a little bit of a bearing. And it happens if you, let's see, go, I think there's another picture after this. Nope, we'll read, okay. So what this area looks like, it's kind of like if you imagined some like tallish kind of Palouse rolling hills with a valley kind of in the middle. Like it's not super impressive, but there's definitely like a place down there and two high spots for people, armies to be on either side. So we'll just jump into some text here and then move on from there. So 1 Samuel 17. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in line and of the battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other, with a valley in between them. And there came up from out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of his coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and he had bronze armor on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went out before him, stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? I am not a Philistine, and you are not. Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And the text goes on to say that Goliath is going to do this for 40 days. He's going to come out morning and in the evening, and these are kind of holy times for Israel too, so he's openly kind of mocking them during really important kind of times of their day. And 40, just for context in the text too, 40 is typically kind of whenever you see 40, it's either like means like a generation or a period of time, trial, things like that. So you see that like the Jews wandered the desert for 40 years. They wandered the desert for a generation. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness being tempted. Moses spent 40 days on Sinai twice, Solomon, Saul, and David were said to have reigned 40 years apiece. Did they reign exactly 40 years apiece? Probably not. But it symbolizes that a generation has passed since they, were king. So just something to keep in mind. And this is going to be obviously challenging for the Israelites, who are already, clearly struggling to trust that God's going to, help them and help them prevail in this message, to have this huge man kind of come out day and night and kind of mock them. So now the story kind of shifts and moves on, and we start focusing on David. And David is a young shepherd boy. He's the youngest of 8, and it kind of begins telling us that he's tending his father's sheep. And then his father, Jesse, says, hey, I want you to take some food out to your 3 oldest brothers, who we're guessing are of fighting age, because it says they followed Saul to battle. And when David reaches the camp, he's completely shocked when he hears Goliath come out and start mocking the God that he spent his entire life kind of trying to worship and learn about. And so he starts to kind of ask, what are we going to do about this? And everybody's just too kind of crippled in fear, and nobody wants to do anything. Nobody wants to go out and fight this guy. And David's talking to his brothers, and he kind of suggests, you know what, I'm going to go do it. And his brothers are like, you're insane. But he goes and he somehow gets in front of Saul, and he talks to Saul, and he talks him kind of into letting him fight this Goliath. And it's interesting that a king of a nation would look at a child who we kind of estimate is probably no older than 15 years old. They must be feeling pretty desperate or paralyzed or, whatever, that they think their best chance at defeating the championship of a foreign army is a 15-year-old boy. I guess this is a picture of the Valley of Elah. So there's your little hills. Nothing like super impressive. This is obviously like a valley, So they could see each other too. Like, it's not like they're like crazy far away. And so they're kind of staring at each other. Yeah. So we'll read through 1 Kings. This is when this is kind of David's pitch to King Saul. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So that was, I guess, an impressive enough resume for him to say, okay, sure. And so next what happens is Saul's like, great, I'll give you my armor and my sword, made for a grown man. Let's put it on you. Let's see what happens. And obviously that doesn't fit. And David's like, I haven't even tested this stuff out. Like, I don't know how to fight in this. And so he says, you know what? I'm just going to take a stick and my sling, and I'm going to be good. Don't worry about it. But it's like he said in the text, shepherds are generally pretty experienced with slings because they use them to kind of throw rocks and direct their herds around. They also, like he said, use them for protection. So he would have been pretty experienced with that. And the text says, David selects 5 smooth stones from a nearby creek, and I present to you a nearby creek. It's not impressive. This is a creek in the Valley of Elah, and it's just a couple rocks on the ground. Probably occasionally during a rain, there's water. I don't know what the climate was like back in this time. Maybe it was a little bit different, but this is kind of what we got. So, and with these stones in hand, he approaches Goliath, and Goliath is kind of offended, and he curses David, and it's like, are you like, basically he's like, are you kidding me? This is the person you sent to fight me. And we'll go on to 1 Samuel here. And when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put in his hand, in his bag, he took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. So some important things to review here, and I'm not even gonna, there's so much going on here that I'm not even gonna touch today, but it's great. And I hope some of what we can get out of today too is that like our text is alive and living, and there's more than just what meets the eye on the surface. So firstly, why does David choose 5 stones? That seems like a pretty it could have just said like David took some stones. He only needed 1. And in the text, you don't want to go too crazy with this, but a lot of the times there's certain numbers that pop up, just like 40, that mean something specific. So 5 typically is going to represent the books of Moses, the Torah, the first 5 texts of the Old Testament. And the example, and Torah tells the Jews when they're worshiping God that they are to put the word of God on their forehead and bind it to their heart. So if we go to Deuteronomy, quick little reference here. You shall therefore lay upon these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign to your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And we have Exodus. And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. And there's like 2 or 3 more of these references throughout. So it's like well-known, kind of a practice. I think there's a picture after this. Bam. Look at that. Text on the arms there, text between the eyes. And so essentially what has just happened is we see textual symbolic imagery of David taking 5 stones, which represents the law, and he's putting that in between the eyes of Goliath, and Goliath basically bows down and worships God is the inference. And that's something that the earliest readers would have probably easily picked up on, because that is something that they're very familiar with. And the interesting thing is that it took, it was the least likely person in this entire story that chose to do something, and he believed and he trusted that God was with him, and in the end he prevailed. And there's something a little more obscure here too that's going on, which I think is really, really neat. Most people miss this. It is kind of obscure, but Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, and one thing that Benjamin, the text tells us, the tribe is known for is that they have a specific group of left-handed, very skilled sling users that reign from the tribe of Benjamin. And Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. And if we go to the next text here. So Judges states that, and the people of Benjamin mustered out of their cities on that day 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who mustered 700 chosen men. Among all these 700 chosen men who were left-handed, every one could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. And the men of Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 men who drew the sword, and all these were men of war. And it gets a little complicated how you want to stretch this. When it talks about Gibeah, Saul is from Gibeah, and you can read this text as saying, those 700 men specifically were from Gibeah. That's where Saul spent a lot of his time. So, should Saul be a really skilled slingsman? Maybe. or in general, Saul being from Benjamin, at least had contextually a chance to have been one of these people. And so I think when we kind of compare Saul to David, we can say Saul, the king of the Israelites, he's the one who should be out there with the sling, fighting this champion in front of everybody. And instead, he chooses a 15-year-old shepherd boy to defend the entire, nation because he didn't trust that God would be on their side. And I find that, to me, very, very compelling. So kind of the point, of all of this is that, God's looking to partner with us. He's looking to partner with us, and for us to be willing to partner with him. And to remember that, we've come from a long line of people who struggled in that. But time and time again, God has shown that he will be with us and that he will provide for us. And that you might not be the most qualified. Maybe you are the right person for the job. Maybe it seems really illogical, but you're able to step into that and try. And I think because of that, God, takes our willingness and, often is able to do great things with that. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I think we, if we extrapolate that, which I will later, into kind of our lives, our willingness to just try in the first place is something that God's just asking for us. So, we'll move on from Elah here, and we'll move up to the Sea of Galilee. So just a little context here, because I think transparency is great. I'm going to be kind of using kind of all of the stories combined from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who are the three disciples who record the story of Jesus going across the lake with his disciples and casting demons out of a man and putting them into pigs. And I think it's important to recognize that each of these Gospels individually is trying to tell its own story to its own group of people, and there is, they're writing to different people who have different contexts, but for this purpose, I'll kind of be, taking bits and pieces. So to set things up here, Jesus has kind of recently given the Sermon on the Mount. He's kind of going all over the place in the Galilee, and he's healing people. He's, telling people to follow, come follow me, and casting out demons, hanging out with lepers, like all the people who nobody else wants to hang out with. And so one day, Jesus tells his disciple, we're going to get in a boat, and we're going to head to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And the region he's taking them to is called the Decapolis. And I think I have a picture after this. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if I'll explain this if you can't really see it, but so this is our map of the Galilee. This is Mount Arbel. I only use Mount Arbel because this is where the picture is taken of. Mount Arbel is on the side of the Galilee where Jesus is going to be doing most of his work. And this is like the safe side. This is where, the Jews are. But over here is the Decapolis. This is like the Gentiles. This is like, you don't go over here. This is dangerous. This is, there's no synagogues. There's no Jews. There's just like, it's bad. You just don't go there. I think there's like some writing like that says if a Jew even said the name of like the Decapolis, like you'd be unclean for 7 days. Like it's that bad of a place. And then, so this is Hippos here. This is kind of the region that Jesus is going to take them to. It's also known as Susita. And from Mount Arbel, looking across the Galilee, there's Susita right over there. And this is from Susita. This is kind of like where the photo over here is taken. So you can see like the Sea of Galilee is not large. It's a lake. And I always love that context too, when I got to go there in person, of realizing how just close everything was. So they weren't traveling massive amounts of miles. But so a little context there. And they can see it. They can probably see people moving on the other side. They can see all of the, unclean Gentiles over there doing whatever. So water real quick. All right. The other thing is, like I said, it's not that much space, so like I guess technically they could have walked around. Jesus says we're getting in a boat, and that is problematic for them. So while some of them are fishermen, they're not going to spend much time far offshore. For the Jews, water has been problematic throughout Scripture. It represents the chaos of creation. The flood is what destroys the earth. The Red Sea was what had, God had to part for them to cross. The Jordan River was a barrier to the Promised Land. Caesarea Philippi, which is actually right up here, which is where God gives Peter the keys to the kingdom, is the location of like a water spring that came out of a cave at the time, and it was widely known as the gates of hell. It was a place of pagan worship. And if we go to the next one real quick, it's in the text. They are at Caesarea Philippi when this is happening. Peter is being commissioned basically by Jesus, and he says, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build your church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." They're right there looking at it, So water is not a great place for them to be. And it's said that they call the Galilee the abyss, which I believe Luke actually does in his telling of the story, which is, obviously essentially like for them this great abyss of like kind of evil and unknowing and a gateway to the underworld. And so they go off across the lake, and a storm blows up, and it's kind of funny because every time Jesus takes his disciples out on the water, it seems like there's a storm. So they're probably not like super stoked, every time they go out with him. So they're freaking out here, and where's Jesus? They find him sleeping on a cushion at the bottom of a boat, like you do in a storm. And they beg him to save their lives. And so he wakes up and he says to the storm, "Be still," and it is still. And we'll read that here. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, Jesus, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care about that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And so I challenge you here too, and this is kind of as we explore Scripture, to begin to ask questions. When we read that Jesus is sleeping in the middle of a storm, like we should probably be like, what that, like, instead of being like, well, it's in the Bible, so that's normal. I wouldn't be sleeping during a storm. So asking ourselves, what is this? Why has the author done this? Why is Jesus done this? And it's probably because he's teaching them a lesson. And so, again, first readers of the story probably likely to go, wait a minute, I remember another story about somebody sleeping in the bottom of a boat. And the last time we saw this was the story of Jonah. And we'll read that. So in Jonah, "But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, 'What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish.' So Jonah was called by God to minister to the Gentiles, and when he tried to run away, he found himself being thrown from a ship and eventually swallowed by a big fish. So the disciples immediately probably would have, recognized Jonah. Jonah is being called to the Gentiles. This is where Jesus is taking us. Like, okay, we get it. Like, this is something that we God has called us to do, and it's important. So when they get to the shore of the Decapolis here, and get all the way across, immediately upon getting out of the boat, in all three stories, Jesus is approached. In one story, he's approached by two people, but for the sake of the story, he's approached by a man. And Jesus, speaks with this, and it's called Legion, the demonic legion, or I am Legion. And you can probably, I imagine kind of the disciples when they get there and immediately seeing this happen, they're like, yeah, of course, Jesus, duh. Like, this is like an evil place. So, of course, some possessed dude's going to come up and immediately talk to us. But Jesus casts out the demons into a herd of pigs, and they run into the abyss, the lake there, and they drown. And the pig herdsmen, probably being quite shocked that they spontaneously just lost their entire, life's work, all of their money, run into town, and the people come out and see this formerly possessed person just sitting there, perfectly fine. He's probably just having a nice conversation with Jesus. And what did the townspeople do? They're completely afraid. They're like, you need to get out of here. Like, Jesus, go. This is, we're not cool with this. Which is probably, different reaction than maybe we would expect when we're reading this story. And so as Jesus is getting back into the boat, the man who was possessed, comes up to him and is like, please come with me, or let me go with you. I really want to go with you. You got to take me. And it kind of makes sense because he probably really has nothing here. Like, he's been outcast. He's alone on his own, has nothing probably. And it's probably it would probably be a really redeeming story for Jesus to be like, yeah, come with me. I'll make you a disciple too. But instead, Jesus says, no, I want you to stay and I want you to tell your story. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him to go. Go home with your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how much he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. So apparently Jesus knew that, one encounter with him was enough to, spread his story. And it wasn't about knowing the text. It wasn't about being a scholar. It was about truly having an experience with God. And he was completely unequipped to do this. We're not really told anything about this person, like what he did in a former life or anything, but for all accounts, he's completely just the last person you would think should be going spread the message of Jesus, right? Because he's going to get it wrong, and he's not going to have the right theology, and he's, whatever. Let's see. Yeah. And the thing is that it seems like this, Jesus sending him off could have actually worked, because we're not really told that Jesus ever comes back here but for one other time. And he never sends his disciples here. We're not really told that he ever interacts with anybody else from the Decapolis. And the next time he comes back, he's going to be met by a great crowd, and he's going to feed 4,000 people. That's just the men. They didn't count the women and children in that story. So he's going to feed over 4,000 people. I think it's important, we could probably take a ton of we could stop it there and take a ton of really incredible, great things out of this. But again, there's something beneath the surface that I think is important to kind of recognize. So the writers of the Gospels, and really the writers of Scripture in general, they're very intentional with the words that they use, because often they're trying to tell a story and a story under the story. and the story under the story under the story. Like they're creating this subversive text that has meaning and life, and they're referencing things that have been referenced before to tell a story without having to tell a story, and so they're really good with their words. And one thing we might notice here, if we really go back and we're looking for it, is that it doesn't seem like the disciples ever left the safety of that boat when they got to the Decapolis. The Gospels, telling a story, they use the term they. They were really good at that. And they got into the boat. They sailed across the lake. They got to the other side, and then it changes. It says Jesus got out of the boat. Jesus talked to the demoniac. Jesus interacted with the townspeople. Jesus got back into the boat. And I think, especially if the gospel writers were writing their own gospel and trying to be impressive and all of these kind of things, maybe one of them would have been like, oh no, I was there. I was standing, and this disciple who Jesus loved the most was standing right there with him. Instead, we just don't hear of the disciples once they get to the Decapolis. And so the thing about being a follower of Jesus is that at some point, just like the disciples, we need to get out of the boat, because in order to make change in our world, we can't just do it from a distance. We have to be there on the ground doing it in person. And sometimes that's really scary, like going across a crazy hell lake and talking to people who are completely different from you, who believe completely different things. But the call that God and that Jesus have put on us is, get out of the boat and I'll be with you. Even the smallest thing can make a huge difference. And so I think, like Ryan talked about, and this is kind of how I wanted to wrap it up, is that this is the kind of church that we want to be at Refuge. We want to be in the Decapolis of our community, in the unserved spaces, which takes both self-awareness for us not to overcommit to things, but also self-awareness to challenge ourselves, when we need to, and not get comfortable. And it also takes a community of support for us to be able to do that, because when you're challenging yourself, it's nice to have a place that's safe to call home and to decompress. So I wanted to kind of wrap this up and kind of share like what that might look like from my own life experience. And that's kind of for me it's been when we started this church. And it's something Ryan also kind of briefly mentioned, back in the summer of 2020 with COVID in full swing and George Floyd having just been murdered, we were looking for the big C church, to kind of step up and to speak up, and to be part of a bigger conversation. We can change something, we can do something as a community, as Christians, we can really make a difference. And for the most part, we met with silence. And so in the midst of this, we watched religious communities fighting tooth and nail against gathering restrictions and mask mandates, and designed to keep the least of us safe, the immunocompromised, the elderly, the sick, and politics and conspiracy theories aside. There's a good case to be made for those practices saving lives. And I wonder maybe if that's pretty Jesus. And so we started asking questions, what about the LGBTQ community? What about women being allowed in leadership? Having a daughter, the question I always go to is, my daughter could be president of the United States of America, but you're going to tell me that my daughter can't preach on a Sunday, Those are the questions that we're asking. And at that same time, we, the people who kind of ended up starting Refuge, we started to see some of these concerns kind of quietly playing out in some of our church communities. And so frustrated, we were kind of asking ourselves if there was even a place for us, in Pullman and Moscow and Faith. are there no religious communities out here that meet our needs? And so we prayed and we brainstormed and we decided that there should be, that there should be a place where women can be in leadership, where the queer community feels welcome. And we took a leap of faith and we set out on this adventure to start this church, fully aware that we could fall flat on our face. And I think that's part of it too, is not assuming that we were going to become some, mega church, like delusions of grandeur kind of a thing, like realistic but optimistic.
Still time.
Yes, that's right. Elle really wants the plane, so. And none of us have planted churches, not a single one of us. Well, I don't know, maybe you guys have helped in that, but no. So none of us had planted churches. We had no idea what we were doing. We literally are making this up as we go. But 2 years later, I, can't believe that we're still here. We're feasible. We're able to pay, Elle as much as we are able to pay her right now, and hopefully more in the future. But it's, to me, incredible. And I'm not saying that you should start a church or a nonprofit or anything like that. But if you're capable and there's a need that needs meeting, don't wait for somebody else to do it. It's easy for us to get really frustrated about things, and especially when it's, I'm kind of speaking community. We can make the biggest difference in our community. Countrywide, that's hard, but we can really make the biggest difference in our community. And if we see something that needs doing and we are capable of doing it, if we're willing to commit a little time, it doesn't take much. We can actually make change in our community. And so that's what getting out of the boat looks like. That's what throwing your stone, trying something new, that's what that looks like. And so our commitment to you at Refuge is that we want to support you in any way we can, as you do these things. We want to be a safe space for you to, go from here and try things and fail and succeed and go on to something bigger and better than, what we do here on a Sunday afternoon. And that doesn't have to be, specifically doing something Christian related or doing something with the church. Maybe that means, wanting to be an elder or on the board of the church, but there are, so many needs out there that need meeting. And I think it's incredible just to consider, we're paying Elle a living wage, not just a living wage, but a wage that she's able to take care of her family with, and hopefully, when we get to the goal of what we actually want to pay here someday, it's a wage worth what she is worth. And our small little community is still at this point, we've made a huge chunk in being able to do that for her. And that's pretty incredible because we are not, masses, and yet we have, we are raising funds for our church to do things that are meaningful. It's not always financial, by the way, but so that's encouraging to me of kind of what we can do going on into the future as a community. So I hope that, maybe there's something that maybe has been on your mind or is on your mind or that comes up, that you've been afraid to maybe step into or try. And I just encourage you to kind of challenge yourself, if you're healthy and able, remembering that you can always say no and stop and set a boundary. But sometimes the act of just doing and trying is what we need to really kickstart us into, getting into the things that we really want to do with our life. So, that's all I got. So I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to do one more song, and then we'll discuss. All right. Father God, I pray that some of what I have shared today can be internalized, even from the mouth of a guy with ADHD who struggles to get his point across sometimes. I pray that through your word, you have impacted us today. I pray that our discussion can be meaningful and that we can find value in the words that we share with each other. I pray that the next song that we hear just helps us transition into a productive discussion. We lift all that up to you.